Thank you so much. And it is a great honor to be here on this auspicious event, to be able to speak about a gentleman with whom I had perhaps a close personal acquaintance for a good number of years. And I want to thank the St. Andrew's Society, the Atwater Library, for giving me this opportunity after I've retired to come back and perhaps bring back a little memories of the fellow that I had so many years of association with. Now, I am going to hopefully keep to time, but I am looking very carefully at my dear lady here to, if I run on, and as a living history reenactor, I literally do not need any microphones, but I was told I had to have it for our diverse audience. So looking at John Redpath, if I could have the first slide, please. There we go. Now, let's get the formalities out of the way about this gentleman. He was born in 1796, lived till 1869, thus dying at the age of 73. He was the son of a second marriage from Scotland. If I could have the, actually, just a moment. While we've got it, the bottom left and the bottom right are his signature. The bottom left is an actual copy of his signature. The bottom left is his signature. Bottom right is the corporate logo for the sugar company he founded. Notice the similarities. I'll come back to that later. Second slide, please. So he was the son of a farm worker, and that was Peter Redpath, and his mother was Elizabeth Pringle. That was the second wife for Peter. And he was born in the small village of Earlston, just inland from Berwick-upon-Tweed. I was born in Newcastle, about 60 miles south. And there's very, very little details about his early childhood. He's not actually registered in any church parish, but that was quite common for second marriage of children. His parents that we can trace died while he was still quite young, and so he went to live with his elder half-sister, Elspeth Fairbairn, whose husband was a stonemason, and they lived in Ledgerwood, very close to Earlston. By the time he is 13, he is now an apprenticed stonemason to a major builder up in Edinburgh by the name of George Drummond. Robert was his son. And he has a lot of credits in the city of Edinburgh that are still there today. Now, he ran his apprenticeship through until 1815. He's now 19. And we must remember what was going on at that time. You had the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Waterloo. But more importantly, you had the social upheaval of all those demobbed soldiers coming back to the United Kingdom. Huge numbers of troops, and basically the same in the Navy, looking for work with no social programs to take care of them. There were even talk about revolution in Britain at the time. And of course, employment, far too many people looking for jobs. Employment is going spare, prices went up, wages went down. John is now trying to survive as a journeyman mason. He's having a really hard time, but then so is everybody else. And the British government came up with this rather nice plan of encouraging emigration. Get rid of them. They put out these incredible pamphlets, putting out places like Australia and Canada as milk and honey locations. Go and dig up the local pavestones and you'll find gold underneath it. These are incredible propaganda documents and are well worth looking up if you want to read about what Canada really was like. So John is part of that Exodus movement, and just for the record, when he left in 1816, he sailed with George's son Robert Redpath, Peter Redpath, his own Robert's son, and Robert Drummond. Now, all of those gentlemen can be traced over here as major building contractors in their own right. They took a sailing ship out of Glasgow, or Greenock, we're not quite certain which, and the trip at that time would have taken anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. And it's a bring your own supplies of food. So how on earth do you work out how much food you're going to need for a trip that could be 6 weeks or 12? And they sail and they get across to Canada and they land at Quebec City. And they start looking for work. And there's none going. In addition, this year, 1816, is known as the year of no summer. Due to sunspots, volcanic eruptions in Indonesia, there was solid ice on the St. Lawrence in June, snowstorms in July, frost in late July, frost in September, and the St. Lawrence closed down because of ice on October the 17th. So, no jobs in Quebec. What do? Well, Montreal has some opportunities. Let's go there. The only problem is none of them had any money. So how did they get there? Shanks's pony. They walked. Now, if you're not quite familiar, that's 160 miles or 352 kilometers. And according to an early letter that was in the collection of the Redpath Sugar Museum, John Redpath, in order not to wear out his shoes and turn out looking for work in poor footwear, walked most of the way barefoot. He gets to Montreal. Next slide, please. And within a couple of months, he's got himself a job as a stonemason journeyman worker to a Mr. Couvret. And the list of the jobs that we can reckon he did, and I don't think any of these are actually existing legacies, were toilet outhouses, garden walls, and storage sheds. Next slide, please. He also, as a staunch Scots Presbyterian, made sure he got in quickly with the local religious community, joining St. Gabriel's Church down near Place d'Armes. By 1918, he's an independent contractor, and that same year, he marries a young lady, Janet McPhee, on December the 19th. He's 22, she's 27. She's the first white child born in Upper Canada in Glengarry County, and her father was a stonemason. So it's all the same community here. 9 months, almost exactly later, they had their first child, called Elizabeth. Now, next slide, please. Here is a map of downtown Montreal. And if you look in the bottom right of the section, you can see Dalhousie Square. This is where John's home was. And the dots on the map, as you see them, are actually some of the locations connected with his early life. And I'll just read you very quickly a list of the things he did in construction. He was involved, for example, next slide, please, in the building of the National Schoolhouse, an expansion of the Masonic Lodge, offices for the Montreal Waterworks Company. He did work for the Montreal Chief Magistrate's Office. His first government contract in building fortifications on St. Helens Island, the Theatre Royal, Molson's Brewery, the first headquarters for the Bank of Montreal, the Lord Nelson column on Place Jacques Cartier, he did repairs on that, and work on the Montreal General Hospital. And remember, he's a staunch Scots Presbyterian, but never let it be said that money stands in the way of good business. Next slide, because one of his bigger projects was the Catholic Notre Dame Basilica. Now, he's got all that, he's doing all right, and by the 1820s, he could have kept going, but now a big opportunity comes up. Next slide. And that is the plan to build the Lachine Canal, bypassing the Lachine Rapids. He's already got one government contract under his belt, and so he already had the credibility with the authorities for doing a project of this kind. 14 kilometers long. He partnered up with an established builder called Thomas McKay, and the two of them worked for the next few years on the building of that Lachine Canal. Now, in the bottom right of that slide, you can see not the building of the canal, but the later expansion of it. And I just want to point out to you that building that's up in that top right-hand corner there. That'll come up a little bit later. During this time, he had 3 more children, Peter, Mary, and Jane. And in 1826, his elder half-sister, Elspeth, that he went to live with when he was younger, and her husband, Thomas, come to Canada at John's pressure, because there's a new project that he thinks Thomas and him could work well together on. Next slide, please. And that's the Rideau Canal. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Rideau was all about, you've got to go back to the War of 1812, when the entire British supply line system went up the St. Lawrence River from Montreal through the various rapids up to Kingston, with the Americans right across the river able to cut that supply line at any time. In the aftermath of the war, the British government wanted to ensure that in any future hostilities, that weak spot of that transport corridor was not there. So they decided to make a diversionary route, a bypass, from Montreal up the Ottawa River to Bytown, after Lieutenant Colonel By, and then through a series of canals and locks down through the Rideau River into the lakes, and then down from there to Kingston from behind, thus completely keeping that supply chain and supply line free of American interference. Bytown is at the top, the next one down is Hartwell's, the next one's Hogsback, and then as you come almost down towards Kingston, you have one that's referred to as Jones Falls. That's what I'll be talking about. Next slide, please. He partners again with Thomas McKay, and the first job they're working on is the locks at Bytown, Ottawa. And if you look in the photograph at the bottom on the right, there's a little building just hidden behind the trees showing in the upper diagram. Next slide, please. That building is the Commissariat building. It is now the headquarters and the museum for the Bytown Historical Society. They worked on that together, and during that construction, a number of the building contractors were defaulting on their work. They were finding the jobs too difficult, or they couldn't make any money on it, and they backed out of the project. So Lieutenant Colonel John By looked for somebody to pick up those contracts. Guess who he chose? John Redpath, which gave him the locks at Hartwell's, bottom left, and Hogsback, bottom right. But the biggest project John was involved with was further down at Jones Falls, literally in the middle of nowhere. Next slide, please. This was a major complex of an arched dam and 4 locks, all interconnected. If you've never been up that section of the Rideau, please take the opportunity. You drive off the Highway 15 down a little tiny road into a valley surrounded by trees and so on. It is the most beautiful place, and exactly as you see it right there in that picture. Next, please. We're talking 5 years of work, during which time he contracts malaria. That arched dam that you're seeing there in that top left and bottom right pictures is shown today in the top right, bottom left. There is not a single piece of grout in that dam. That is a keystone dam. It is hand-cut blocks of stone fitted together like Lego bricks. And it's still operational today. It was the second largest dam of its kind in the world when it was built, and today it ranks as 4th. Next. Here he is. That's what he looked like at the time. And for doing that work on the Rideau, he was given a silver trophy cup in connection with Mr. Mackay. That cup was in the collection that I had the pleasure of running at the Redpath Sugar Museum. When I got that, it was absolutely black because it had been lacquered. Yeah. And so it took a good few months of careful work to bring it up to something approaching a displayable condition. But what I want to bring to your attention is that signature on the bottom left. I've already said it was later used as the logo for the Redpath Sugar Company. But I have to tell you about where it came from. I was doing the research for my book on the Redpath, and I'm at the McCord Museum, and they've got the ledgers from the building. So all the details are right there, day by day. It's a fabulous source. And I'm going through one of the ledgers, and it's about this big. And I open up the inside front cover, and there on a blank sheet of the page, John Redpath, John Redpath, John Redpath, John Redpath. The guy is sitting there on the Rideau Canal practicing his signature. How many of us have done that in our time to get a distinctive signature? And here it was in front of me. I mean, how close can you get to a guy when you know that he's sitting in a tent by candlelight practicing his handwriting? That was my eureka moment. Next. All right. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of pictures, but I do have a good bit of information about what happened after he'd finished that project. Well, first of all, he made a good bit of money. So now he comes back to Montreal, and he's doing very well, thank you. And now he starts getting himself involved in local community activities and so on in the Montreal area, not the least of which was being on the committee that established the first adult education operation, the Mechanics Institute. So the start of this, John's right on in it. 1833, because of the health conditions in Montreal at the time, he moves out of Dalhousie Square and moves over towards St. James Street, towards the west. There's also a situation developing in Lower Canada regarding the English-French divide and the political unrest around the 1832 rebellion. Things are not, socially quite as stable as he would like, but he's now starting to invest. So here's some of the things he started investing in. The property out on the Montreal outskirts and up on the Rideau Canal. He's doing business investments in transportation, namely the Ottawa Steamboat Line, the Montreal Towboat Company, the Bank of Montreal. In 1833, at the age of 36, he's invited to become a director of that bank. Now, if you think about it, that's pretty young to be invited to become a director of a major operation like the Bank of Montreal. And he's also on the committee of management to run the Montreal General Hospital. A year or so later, 1834, problems. An immigrant ship turns up in the harbor. It's got cholera on board. It hits the city and sweeps throughout the city, killing not thousands, but tens of thousands. John is actually part of the committee to build the quarantine hospitals and the sanitation buildings. So he's trying, but on July the 26th, his wife, Janet, dies of cholera. It's her 43rd birthday. And the accounts are that basically she was fine in the morning, she was dead by noon, lost 50% of her body weight, and she's in the grave by 3 o'clock. You've got to remember, cholera is like diarrhea and vomiting on steroids. Body loss within a matter of hours put people into comas and killed them. And because of the fact that this is such a rampant infectious disease and nobody knew about germs and so on, the only thing they could do was get them into the grave as quick as possible and out of their homes. Now, I want you to just imagine this situation. It's his wife's birthday. She says she's not feeling too good. By noon, she's dead. John's got all the children from that marriage. He's got to look after them. So he's got to get her into the grave. So the first thing he does is he calls the minister to his local Presbyterian church, only to find out the guy is actually out doing more burials. So he turns to his brother Robert, and Robert's minister administers the last rites and does the burial service. But John still has to look after the living children. So he evacuates with those children up to the Rideau system and goes to live with Thomas and Elspeth up in Jones Falls. Now, while he's up there, his old business friend, Robert Drummond, who was a big builder up in Kingston, dies of cholera. Well, John travels from Jones Falls on the Rideau down to Kingston to pay his respects. And while he's there, he meets Robert's niece and nephew who had been out in Canada visiting. And just as in any case where you have mutual sorrow and loss, they became very fast group as the three of them. But in particular, John and Jane developed a friendship that was to last for years. Now, I should say, at this point, Jane is 18. Okay. He's in a period of official mourning when nothing is supposed to be done socially. And yet, in December of that year, his wife had died in July. In December of that year, John takes the time to come from Jones Falls down to Montreal for the first inaugural dinner of the St. Andrew's Society. Now, this is not socially appropriate. What's going on? Well, we'll get to that shortly. When he eventually comes back to Montreal, he is made an elder of the St. Paul's Presbyterian Church, and he is made the chair of the Committee of Management for the St. Andrew's Society. That relationship between John and Jane developed, and on September 1835, John marries Jane. He is now 39. She is just a couple of weeks shy of her 20th birthday. But that political situation is now worsening. And in 1836, it forced John and his fellow members of the Mechanics Institute to suspend operations. It just wasn't safe to keep going at that point. We're also dealing with the aftermath of that cholera epidemic, and he decides enough's enough. I'm not going to live in Montreal anymore. I'm getting the heck out. Now, that doesn't mean he's leaving. Instead, he decides to move a little higher in the chain of properties. Next, please, sir. This is the city of Montreal. And if you notice in the upper left corner, there's a green highlighted section. That consists of 235 acres of a farm known as the de Rivière Farm, going all the way from Dorchester, all the way up and over the top of Mount Royal. He paid, at that time, £10,000. And I went online yesterday to try and look at historical conversion currency, and according to that, his payment for that farm comes in at $1.5 million. American. This is his quote in a letter of what he wanted to do with that property. The situation is delightful, and my time is occupied in improving the property, which keeps me in employment and suits my taste to live private and retiring, having all the necessary enjoyments of life within ourselves. He's not interested in anything podium-based or front and center. He just wants a nice, quiet life. But let's look at this little property and his house. Next. First, on the left, you can see the lower section within the mounds of the city of Montreal, and the little red square in the upper section is his house. Further, slightly down to the right is the original farmstead of the de Rivière family. He lived there while his new house was being built. He called it Terrace Bank. Next. Nice little place. Next. Next. That's the backyard. Oh, the lower section of the backyard. I had the opportunity to see the original architectural plans for that building, which are in the McCord Museum. And you've got all these incredible drawings showing all the ornate details of the stonework, the steps and everything. And virtually every single drawing has got these little handwritten notes on it. Change this, alter that, tweak this, tweak that. And it's all John Redpath's handwriting. The guy was right in there throughout that whole building process. Next. That, for example, is the front gates at Sherbrooke Street at the bottom of what is now Mountain Street. And that little set of circular and triangular patterns is refigured throughout the architecture of the house and even the furniture in the house. Next. The upper section, I've done a blow up of it on the bottom, and you can see the arrow pointing to the house. And on the right are drawings from the original architectural plans, what I derived and had redrawn by my son. Next. Okay, so basement on the bottom left, then the main floor, the upper floor, and the attic. Now, I don't know if you can see on that screen, but if you look inside the black areas at the attic on the left by the stairs, can you see 3 little white dots and 2 white dots in the wall itself? Okay. Now, go to the basement in the bottom left-hand corner. Furnace. This house, 1834, had built-in forced air central heating. I think he's actually following the old Roman hypocaust system. After all, he was born on plenty of Roman ruins in the area where he was born. But think about it, folks. This is a guy that's got forced air central heating in his home in 1834. Next. Okay, we come back to the overall city and the property. All he wants is a quiet life. But that ain't going to happen. Because we're now in the period of 1836-37. And we are talking about the outbreak of the rebellion. Now, it's time, unfortunately, to step up and be counted. And when you were faced at that point in time with the political issue of the legislature forcing through things to literally produce a cultural expulsion of anything that wasn't French Canadian within the province, and the paramilitary organization of the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society openly parading with arms in front of the British troops, the local communities in Montreal that were not French felt they had to do something. And so they established organizations, including the St. George's Society, the already existing St. Andrew's Society, the St. Patrick's Society, the German Central European Society, and members of the Jewish community, who put themselves together as a coordinated body under the term of the Constitutional Association. Guess who was the chair of the management committee? So, they decide that they want to prove to the British government that they're willing to stand up to support the government in time of emergency. So they go to the Governor General and say, look, we got all these people. All we're asking from you is that you provide us, if an emergency happens, with arms, ammunition, and we'll step up. Unfortunately, the British government's position, and especially the Governor General's position, was that of appeasement. And he literally told them, I'm not going to do anything to the Patriots, and you've got to disband. You've got to step down. So what do? Well, they're loyal. They walk out the room, and they admit and say, okay, fine. We will disband our official organization. Oh, but anybody fancy doing a club to do some physical exercise and lectures and talks and training on various physical subjects? Yes, good idea, let's do it. They called it the Doric Club. It was actually an underground paramilitary organization. They couldn't do it openly. And there's no records to show who was involved, where the money came from. But guess who was the secretary of the Doric Club? All right. By the time Queen Victoria comes to the throne, things have got so bad that members of the Quebec legislature are refusing to sign or swear their oath of loyalty. And of course, violence is increasing, intimidation is increasing. Even the Catholic Church came out publicly and denounced all this violence. The response from the legislature will abolish the Catholic Church in a new secular state in Lower Canada. Finally, the British government says enough's enough. And to all intents and purposes, war breaks out, civil war. And John Redpath, of course, is part of the Central Coordinating Committee for the Constitutional Association and the Doric Club. And when the war breaks out and the Governor General puts a French Canadian out to get the militias together, which would normally take weeks if not months, A committee walks into his office and says, "What do you need?" And in 24 hours, they had 4,000 trained men on the streets of Montreal, locking down the gates, locking down the bridges, and so on, and basically taking control of the city for police action, freeing up the very limited number of British troops to actually go out and deal with this situation as a whole. And that group of French-Canadian loyalists, English, Irish, Scottish, Jewish, Central Europeans, controlled the city of Montreal right through till the following March of 1838, when the rebellion had collapsed. All right, so what do we do now? Well, the British government sends a commission over under Lord Durham as the new Governor General to try and figure out what's going to happen. And a delegation goes to talk with him about what the opinion is of the various other communities. Guess who's on the committee? So John Redpath is actually talking directly to Lord Durham. And when the Durham report comes out in 1841, it contains several of the recommendations that John and his committee had put forward, which today go down in history. If you want to call it a legacy, here's something. We're talking about responsible government. We're talking about legislative democracy and the foundation of what became colonial unification and confederation. John is right there in the middle of all of that. Not because he wanted it, but because circumstances forced him to do so. Now, in a parallel situation in 1840, the island of Montreal was under a feudal regulation that every land transfer had to be approved by the Saint-Sulpicians. So John's on a committee going over to England, talking to the British government about getting that dropped. He comes back. Now he's noticed by the British government. So when he gets back, he is nominated to be part of the new city council. He is offered the mayorship of Montreal, but he turns it down. He doesn't want to be up front. So he turns it over and hands it over to Peter McGill. He keeps going, though. He's now a councillor and alderman. He's on the Financial and General Accounts Committee for the City of Montreal, so every penny that the government spends in Montreal, he's the chair of the committee. He's in charge of the Roads and Improvements Committee, the new Montreal municipal offices, the expansion and development of the harbour facilities, dredging and navigation on the St. Lawrence, and the widening of the west ends of Sherbrooke, St. Catharines, and Dorchester. So where it goes from being very narrow down the west end to being a nice big boulevards, it's all John's committee that's doing all of that. He also is one of the very first people to do subdivisions for estates off his property. Notice below Sherbrooke, notice the square blocks, but notice the size of the properties to the right. Look how small they are in relative terms. He is the one that developed and established what was this town landscape of Montreal in the 1840s, developing those properties with their large estate homes in good property. I mean, the guy just keeps going at this point. He becomes a director of the Montreal Fire and Inland Navigational Insurance, a vice president of the Provident and Savings Bank. He is now the chair for the new headquarters at Place d'Armes for the Bank of Montreal. And he is one of the founders of an entirely new denomination of religion in Canada, the Free Presbyterian Church of Canada. Because there was the great split called the division, and where one element of the congregations felt that all the authority lay in the original church in Scotland, and those that felt self-rule, self-work. John's involved in all that. So he actually ends up in part of the split, and he actually ends up funding 3 Presbyterian churches in Montreal alone, and becomes an alderman, an elder of those churches. Now, I know I'm blathering on, but by the time you get to the late 1840s, you've got another problem. The British government is now changing its policies of protectionism for the Canadian colonies and is instituting free trade under the Corn Laws. This basically bankrupts the Montreal merchants and a lot of the social elite of Montreal. So when they go to the government and ask for protection and they get told, they turn around and say, fine, you want to play that game? No problem. Tell you what, we'll separate away and we'll go and join and become annexed by the United States. No separation, no violence. You've got to agree to it, but no harm, no foul. We'll just separate, do our own thing, and go off. Well, this freaks the British government out. So they actually start reintroducing legislation to protect the colonies as we move into 1850s. Next. This is a photograph actually taken from Mount Royal, and at the bottom you can see the top of John's house, but off in the distance in that smoke, there's something else. The first industrial commercial production facility built in the city of Montreal. Next. The Redpath Sugar Refinery. Now, before he started this, he looked at doing cotton mills, iron foundry, copper mining, shipbuilding, shipping. But there was a problem in all of those. Somebody else was already doing it first. So he'd have to compete. John was never one to try to compete with anybody. He wanted something that nobody else was doing. So he has this mega structure built on the banks of the Lachine Canal, which of course he'd helped build. And he starts what became the oldest existing sugar company in Canada. Next. Here are some pictures through the years. Next. This was one of the first to introduce women into the unionized workforce in 1912. And here's the kicker. Although John wasn't around, one of his family descendants, Huntley Redpath Drummond, paid the women equal pay for equal work. 1912. Next. The factory continued operations until 1980, when it was eventually closed. Most of it was demolished, and now, of course, there's only one central building, the old original 1854 building with its 1902 superstructure. It's condo. Mind you, it was fun when I went down there during the construction, and in the section slightly to the left, they kept telling me they were finding these thousands and thousands of horseshoes. Horseshoes. And the reason for that, I worked out, was that in the very beginning, the part of the filtration system they used at that time used bones as a filtration adsorption medium. Well, I automatically thought, oh, cow bones and stuff like that. No, horses. Think about it. When you've got all the horses that you're slaughtering who are out of death, what are you going to do with them? Well, basically, they took the bones and they burned, they cooked them down into charcoal to use as a filtration medium, and they just chucked all the horseshoes out into the backyard. Next. In his later years, what's he doing? Well, he's getting involved with transport again. The Victoria Bridge project. He was a major proponent of that and a big investor. Next. He's on the expansion for the Montreal General Hospital. Bottom left, the establishment of the St. James Club. Very nice. And in coordination with his wife, Jane, he is one of the founders of the Presbyterian College, now connected with Montreal. And that, by the way, in conjunction with Jane, was one of the very first institutions to offer courses to women exclusively under the Montreal Ladies Educational Association. And John put up a lot of the money for the founding of that, and then his wife Jane took it on with her daughters, daughters-in-law, granddaughters, because she was a woman in her own right. Next, he made his final trip back to Scotland in 1867, just after Confederation. That is the square at Earlston, at which point he donated a clock on the left to that town. And that clock is still running today. He retired as the president of the Canada Sugar Refinery in '68. In March of '69, he actually suffered a couple of strokes, but he finally died on the 5th of March, 1869. And because of the ground, everybody was using sleighs. Now, do you remember that property he had at Terrace Bank? It went right up the top and down the back of the hill. Well, guess what? When earlier the Protestant cemetery in Old Montreal was full and had to be moved, he was the chair of the committee for the establishment of the Mount Royal Cemetery Corporation, and he was a trustee on that board for the rest of his life. The only thing he insisted when he sold off the back half of his property was that he reserved a section for him and his family. Next slide. And today you can visit John and his family in situ on the mountain. And Janet was moved from the old Protestant cemetery up and reinterred right there. And their graves, John, Jane, and a number of the other kids, are all right there. And if you go to the Mount Royal Cemetery, they have a guidebook. Guess which is the first name to go visit and have a look at? So, how do you define a legacy? Do you define it as the building works, the things that are still physically around? Do you define it as what you did that influenced the development of your community or your country? Do you define it as what you and your family did in due course? Well, in the case of John Redpath, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can say he covered all three. And unfortunately, I don't have time to give you the background details of what the women of this organization, this man's family, were about, because we're talking alphas all the way down the line. Now, before I conclude, does anybody have any questions?
Richard, that was magnificent. What a life and what a legacy. I'm afraid we have time for one quick question. Daniel Boyer, you have to speak into the microphone. And if there's a Zoom question, I'll ask Jason to alert me. So Daniel Boyer, would you come up quickly, please? Because the Zoom audience can't hear unless you use the mic. Very quick.
Very quick. Thank you so much, sir, for an outstanding presentation. Of course, the Redpath's links to McGill University are still current and present in the Redpath Museum, Redpath Hall. I could go on for hours about that. And you did allude to it parenthetically, shall we say, with a Presbyterian college. But could you expand on how did the Redpaths know McGill? I mean, how does all that work out?
Thank you, sir. You've just given me the excuse to keep going.
Oh, yeah.
Not that. No.
I need it. You need that.
All right. Can we move to the next slide, please, then? Very quickly. So, John's second wife, right through, please, right down to the lady after the graveside one. You got me? Great. All right, so John's second wife, Jane Drummond Redpath. She was born in 1815, died in 1907 on January the 30th. Fluently bilingual. This is his family. John in the middle, his first wife above, second wife below. Janet above, Jane below. Moving off to the left hand, the next column, 7 children by the first wife, Elizabeth, Peter, Mary, and so on. The column on the right, his second wife, 10 children, and their respective spouses on the outside. Now, next slide. Jane Drummond Redpath. She's fluently bilingual. She's a founding member of the Montreal Ladies Educational Association and a strong proponent of women's education at McGill, along with Dawson. She is one of the ones that ends up pushing the idea of women attending lectures, then taking exams, and eventually getting qualifications on par with men. She dragoons her daughters, daughters-in-law, and granddaughters into that educational association, and of course they've got tentacles all over the society, so there's plenty of pressure there. She is the president of the French Canada Missionary Society, the Women's Missionary Society, running hospitals in Montreal, and new immigrant centers and schools, all staffed and run by women. Next. Yeah, to answer your question, sir, John's eldest son, Peter, he ends up being on the Board of Governors for McGill. He endowed a chair of natural philosophy, the Peter Redpath Museum, the Redpath Library, at which point he donates over $500,000 and 3,000 books. President of the Montreal General Hospital. Marries the lady on the right, Grace Wood. And there's a good story about Grace and Jane, because don't forget, the two of them are actually only about 3 weeks apart in ages. Their later life was a very interesting situation. Next one. Oh, we're out of time. If anybody wants to know more about those little juicy family bits, see me afterwards.
Richard. Richard, on behalf of the audience, I'm inviting you back, because there's just too much to share about the incredible life and legacy of John Redpath. Ian Batchin is Vice President of the St. Andrew's Society of Montreal, our co-host, and I'm about to hand him the mic and ask him to move over so the Zoom audience can see.
Thank you, Lynn. Richard, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk for almost an hour there. That absolutely flew by. We're very grateful for you to come all the way from Toronto today to support this. This is a tradition that's very dear to the St. Andrews Society, supporting this during our ball week. Tomorrow we have 400 people coming to the ball at the Chateau Champlain, so very excited about that. Excited as well to be welcoming Colin Mockery and his wife Deborah McGrath as well as guests of honour. So we have an excellent night planned tomorrow as well, hopefully. So on behalf of the Society, thank you so much for everybody that's attended today. I think this is the biggest crowd that I've seen, certainly in the 3 years that I've been here. I know we had over 70 on the Zoom screen as well there. I even saw Bobby Redpath, I think, so curious to know if there's a family connection there. So there is? Okay, so there you go. But again, Richard, thank you. For somebody that moved to Montreal 18 years ago, I lived in Point St. Charles for 3 years, just across the street from where the Redpath refinery is. So great for me to understand a little bit more about the history there as well. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, again.